Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just over 15 years ago, the Medicare Part D prescription drug program was forced through this House in the middle of the night after hours of threats and arm twisting. Pharmaceutical manufacturers poured millions into lobbying the Congress to manipulate an important benefit for seniors for themselves instead. With the opening of the largest market in America, Big Pharma ensured that it would retain monopoly power by inserting one notable line, a prohibition on Medicare negotiation of drug prices. With prices for the most commonly prescribed drugs under Medicare soaring at about 10 times the rate of inflation, more than 2 years ago, I was joined by most committee Democrats in respectfully but unsuccessfully asking for a hearing from the then chair on drug pricing. Today, we finally get that hearing. I would ask unanimous consent to include the rejected request in the record.
Without objection.
Today's witnesses have offered compelling testimony regarding the harm of the committee's previous indifference and the harm to Americans of leaving a vital part of our healthcare system in the control of pharmaceutical monopolies and oligopolies. Chairman Neal is absolutely correct that a number of different legislative proposals are necessary because, unfortunately, there is no wonder drug for price gouging. I have been joined by 110 members of the House in advancing House Resolution 1046, the Medicare Negotiation and Competitive Licensing Act. I would ask Professor Sachs, what advantages does competitive licensing offer to achieve fair prices?
Thank you for the question. So once Medicare negotiation is on the table in whatever form, there is this question about what would happen if the pharmaceutical industry refused to negotiate a fair price or a mutually beneficial resolution. And so one set of policies we've already heard a little bit about is threatening exclusion from a formulary, even if the product is the only one in its class. Even though it might be unlikely that a company would abandon the U.S. market, that threat of exclusion would pose access concerns that we've heard about. And so the licensing proposal has the benefit of dealing with that problem by providing incentives for generic or biosimilar manufacturers to fill the gap that the branded company was disinclined to fill.
So one advantage of it is that you don't have the argument that we just heard in prior questioning that we're going to deny life-saving drugs to some seniors on Medicare. With competitive licensing, you assure access to all types of pharmaceuticals, but at a more reasonable price than under the current system.
It makes it far more likely that patients would not be denied
because
access.
if you can't go to the negotiating table without something to compel negotiation, can you? And
yes, I believe that's correct.
Don't all the other alternatives envision ultimately some type of formulary which does in fact deny some drugs in order to get negotiation at fair prices?
To my knowledge, that's correct.
One of the alternatives that you mentioned and that Dr. Miller mentions is to use compulsory arbitration as an alternative way of achieving fairer prices for some drugs. What limitations does that approach have?
Well, as with any complicated procedure, there are a number of details to be worked out, and the procedure is often closely related to the substantive outcome that's achieved. So it would be, I'll mention two just in the interest of time. One would be how would the government's offer be set in the first instance? What instructions would be given to the arbiter in terms of enabling them to choose between the different offers that were provided? And then what's the enforcement mechanism? As we've discussed, what's the incentive to arbitrate in the first instance, or what would happen if the pharmaceutical company chose not to accept the price that the arbiter set? That puts us back into the discussion we've just had about threatened exclusion versus licensing.
Is there also the possibility of simply shifting responsibility from Medicare or from the Secretary to an unknown arbiter for the final decision?
The choice of the arbiter would be a topic that this committee would want to consider carefully, yes.
Thank you so much, and to all our witnesses.